So welcome to all. Great that you're all joining us online with this seminar of the African Studies Center this afternoon. It's a great honor and a great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Barbara Bompani from the University in Edinburgh African Studies Center. As you can read from the description of her talk of this afternoon, she's a reader in Africa and International Development at the Center of African Studies and the School of Social and Political Science at the University of Edinburgh. She is a prolific writer on issues of religion and development in various parts of Africa, with a specific focus on South Africa, Uganda, and Kenya, and has also been interested in studying development of charismatic Christianity in these various parts of Africa. And on that account, I would like to draw your specific attention, if I may, to one of the edited books that she has published a couple of years ago, which I really find a very inspirational source of writing, the title of which is Christian Citizens and the Moral Regeneration of the African State. And I'm pretty sure that also in her talk of today, many of the insights that were collected in that work on the position of charismatic Christianity in various state developments in Africa will also be part of what she will be addressing. So the title of her talk of today is "The Memory of Persecution is in Our Blood, Documenting Loyalties, Identities and Motivations to Political Action in the Ugandan Pentecostal Movement." So we're all looking forward to your talk, Barbara, which is, of course, great to have. And we are inviting you to speak to your paper for about 40-45 minutes, and then we will break for a short break of 5 minutes, and then we go into the Q&A session in the second part of this seminar. So please, Barbara, take the online floor. We're looking forward.
Thank you so much, Raik, for the kind introduction, and thank you everyone in Leiden for having me. It's such a pleasure being here with you, and such a pleasure to share my research and my current project and my latest work with you today, and also getting feedback and discussion. I wish we were doing that in person, but these are exceptional times, and anyway, this virtual space is already fantastic for me. So, as Raik said, I spent many years working on the interconnection between religion and politics, and religion and development, and especially what religious organizations do, what they say, how they are motivated, and so on, in working in the public sphere, in the public. I work a lot in South Africa, I work a lot in Uganda. I'm currently running a project in Kenya with Ugandan LGBT refugees escaped from Uganda to Kenya, and I'm looking at their support through churches, or the negative element of religion that is doing their life, that is causing persecution and discrimination towards this community and minorities. So I focus on religion from different angles, and as Raik said, I work quite a lot on focusing and investigating the moral aspect of religion in Uganda, and how morality actually shape and motivates the everyday action and public action of these churches. But today I'm here actually to challenge myself to say something else, to say that actually it's not sufficient to put so much emphasis on the focus of morality as a motivator of these churches, as something that is really pushing them. But actually we need to do something else in addition. It's important to see how the fact that actually they really want to shape the moral side of Ugandan citizens is important. But also there are other reason why they are public actors, and they're really dynamic public actors. And that is, those reasons lies in the history in the specific connection with politics and the memory of the history of the origins of the movement. And so what I'm going to say today is actually that in my presentation, I really would like to extend to this literature by providing a fuller explanation for the reason behind the public transformation of these churches and their relation to power, in particularly their loyalty to and support for President Museveni and the ruling party. So drawing on participant observation and interviews conducted over several years, this presentation argues that along with theological and moral explanations and more global explanation that are related to a lot of works on Pentecostalism as a global religion that put a lot of focus on technology, on wealth and accumulation and so on. All along this explanation is also important to understand how local and contextual dynamic interplay. Indeed, the uncertainties and memories of the difficult origins of the Pentecostal-charismatic movement and the lack of legal recognition, as I'm going to demonstrate in this presentation, the lack of legal recognition as fully registered churches still impact on the present and motivate those churches to be very dynamic socio-political actors in need to forge strong connection with central power in Museveni Uganda. So I'm really going to draw quite a lot today from my fieldwork, from time spent in Uganda, and from what emerged from these churches, why their public action is so important, what they're trying to achieve with their everyday work and where their connection with power, why it's so important for them to be connected with power, that in Uganda most of all means with Museveni and with his family. So this is, that you see in the photos, is one of my case studies that is Miracle Center Cathedral. And I'm going to guide you there right now. So entering the gate of Miracle Center Cathedral, the largest Pentecostal mega church in Uganda, for the Sunday service at 8 a.m., I was carefully searched by armed guards with metal detectors. They check all my belongings, ask a few general questions about where I was from, why I was there, if it was my first time, and then they move on checking the taxi that was taking me to the church in the leafy and green hill of Rubaga, where the church is based, a space in Kampala. Churchgoers were stopping by the long marquee at the right side of the main door to buy books and CDs by Pastor Robert and Pastor Jessica Kayanja, but also soap bars, notebooks, and other memorabilia with the logo of Miracle Center, a fashionable brand. After all, this is a church well known in the country for its glitz and glamour, as services as well as the frequent fashion show and gala events organized by Pastor Jessica. The service that day focused on Genesis 25 and Genesis 27. The sermon led by Pastor Jessica centered on the story of Rebecca, Isaac, and their sons Jacob and Esau. And even if you're not so familiar with Bible and theological issues and sacred texts, I'm going to explain now why this is relevant. The message indeed was about unmaintained promises and on the meaning of sacrifice, the sometimes difficulties of understanding our own path in life, and the importance of abiding to God. The passage that Pastor Jessica read were projected on the maxi screen behind her. Through the microphone she said, and I'm going to put the quote here, "People look at this church, Miracle Center, at people going to this church for the way we wear dress, with reference to the poor origins of this religious community, but we have overtaken. It looked like we didn't qualify, but we sacrificed. At the beginning, this was a Papyrus Church, a Kiwempe Church, that means a poor church with no building, as I'm going to explain later. At the time, people would look at us and wonder what we were doing. We were not qualified by the look, but we were qualified by our hands." And this is a reference to the Bible passage of Jacob showing his hand to his father Isaac in Genesis 27. "The Lord knows your hand. We started to serve God. We started as a small group here. We were 4 of us working hard. People were saying, 'Who are those ones singing like Americans?' Indeed, the origins of Miracle Center are modest and a very different affair from the current mega building that you have seen in the photo. A building that accommodates 10,500 seats, with Pastor Robert Kayanja being an internationally acclaimed gospel preacher. As Pastor Jessica expressed in her sermon, these churches that spread across Uganda along with the third wave of Pentecostalism were initially lacking in resources and were identified as poor religious communities. And again, if you're not an expert, very familiar with the language and history analysis of Pentecostalism, the third wave of Pentecostalism is what we experience now, and is the wave of charismatic Pentecostalism, and the wave that actually is associated with the big growth of churches around Africa. These churches at the beginning, in fact, were commonly called Kiwempe churches in Uganda. They were called poor churches or papyrus churches, as they were named after the simple papyrus reed structure that constituted the place of worshiping, used instead of proper brick buildings. They were too poor to buy to have proper buildings, and so they were defined as very poor churches. Pastor Jessica Kayanja's preaching highlights a very important issue that is central in understanding the complex and diverse Ugandan Pentecostal movement that emerged and spread towards the end of the 20th century. This is the memory of the genesis and challenges of the movement as minority churches emerging in an era of national devastation after Idi Amin. And then reconstruction with humble means and no resources in a hostile religious landscape that at the time was predominantly divided between Anglicans and Catholics. Another important issue that emerged from my analysis is the difficult relationship to politics of the origins and the hardship, fear, and uncertainty experienced in the early days due to the direct persecution applied by Idi Amin's regime when those churches were banned and oppressed. From the onset, indeed, Amin attempted to control and put pressure on all Uganda's religious community. However, Anglican, Catholic, and Muslim leaders remained relatively free to express their views as long as they didn't stray from religious issues, while other so-called not officially recognized religious groups at the time, as the Pentecostal, were banned and had to operate underground to escape the threat of persecution. The feeling of uncertainties for those churches continued during the unstable time of Obote II, the regime between 1980 and 85 before Museveni. And as one pastor told me, there was no legality during this time in practicing religion. People were still scared even when Idi Amin was gone. It was difficult, he said, this pastor. Guerrilla fighters during Obote II infiltrated in the new growing churches, the new Pentecostal churches, and the government was spying on us. It is only during the Museveni era that Pentecostal felt free to operate openly and subsequently flourish, as frequently recalled by participants. As you can read here, there is a quote. It says, "It was only until this president came in that there was freedom of worship. This nation went through serious oppression and we could not find freedom. But this oppression prepared our nation for the great Pentecostal movement that you see today. After 1986 transition, when Museveni took power, when the we had an opportunity, a pruning ground to usher in the revival you are seeing today." So the narrative of Museveni as the protector of the Pentecostal movement is so frequently reinstated in this religious circles that also younger generation with no memory of the hardship of the origins are familiar with this role played by Museveni, but this sort of mythical understanding of the importance of Museveni as the protector of the Pentecostal movement. Let's read here another quote. "The pastor tell their congregation, many of whom are young, that in the past was so difficult to have freedom to pray and that now we have this freedom. This makes Museveni seem so great. So the Pentecostal must keep him for fear. Even though the young don't remember, and even if their parents were not Pentecostal then they are told they must pray for the continued freedom under the president and pray that the government doesn't change." Much academic attention has been paid to the role of HIV/AIDS pandemic in catapulting Pentecostal churches into the Ugandan public sphere. Indeed, at the beginning of the 21st century, they were well placed to access international funding and gain influence as local moral actor, given the political shift towards values like abstinence and personal responsibility, within funding streams like the United States President's emergency plan for HIV/AIDS relief, that really was targeting this moral actor for distributing and channeling this funding. And this gave them the platform to become visible, active public actors in Uganda, where they have continued to play this role, for example, in launching moral campaigns like the Crusade in support of the anti-homosexuality bill. And here in the photo, you can see a photo and a pamphlet from my fieldwork around this moral campaign against sexual minority. However, there are further contextual reasons that need to be unpacked in order to understand this religious community's transformation into socio-political actors. Firstly, the memories of their arduous origins, difficult origins, frequently articulated by religious leaders and church members, that function as a form of unifying foundational story that offer a shared identity and commonality to the otherwise diverse and frequently divided Ugandan Pentecostal community. Secondly, the anxiety generated by the memory of persecution at the hands of the past political establishment and the feeling of uncertainty due to the legal status that I'm going to specify later are also important elements in understanding their relationship with politics and their vocal public support of the Museveni regime in the present, in an attempt to seek protection and secure their legal recognition as their counterpart, the mainland churches. This presentation aims to shed light on these two understudies dynamics, arguing that along with the theological and moral preoccupation, it is important to understand historical dimension that continues to influence these churches in the present day. Why its global character and international connection are important in understanding the Pentecostal movement, I would argue that it's also crucial to understand the contextual, micro-political interaction between churches and their relationship to the state and to politics in order to fully grasp the conditions that allow them to become energetic public actors in contemporary Uganda. The Pentecostal movement started in a precise year in Uganda, in 1960. The missionary who initiated the movement in Kampala came from Canada. Pastor Hugh and Audrey Lazel from the Glad Tiding Temple in Vancouver were sent by their mother church to plant a new religious community in Uganda after a church member, the assistant of the senior pastor, had a vision. As you can read from their autobiography, this quote, the assistant said, "I felt the Spirit of God speak to me and say, I will lead you to these people, yet to another country. My immediate response was, which one? But no answer came." And then she goes on in the quote saying that actually God didn't speak immediately, he spoke the day after, and she saw this word appearing that said Uganda. But she didn't know where Uganda was. Indeed, the autobiography continues saying that she then looked for the country on the map of Africa because, as she recalls, she didn't know where it was. Then they inquire with the Canadian government whether it would have been possible to travel and plant a church there. But the answer was that, from the government, quotations, it would be difficult, if not impossible, to get into that country. Pastor Lazel subsequently wrote to the British authorities in Uganda, at the time still a British protectorate, with the purpose of gaining permission to start a Pentecostal mission in this country. The request was denied, with a reply that made it clear that the Anglicans and the Roman Catholic were well-established churches, and they would remain the only Christian mission in the country. The Lazel family embarked anyway for East Africa, while waiting for a more positive response from Uganda. In 1956, they arrived in Kenya, and hosted by other already established evangelical missionary churches from North America, they started to preach the gospel in Mombasa. In 1960, under the new global circumstances amid the crumbling of colonialism, the Lazel finally received a permit to do missionary work in Kampala, where they stayed for 13 years until Idi Amin's hostile policies toward foreigner and non-traditional churches, that means not established mainland churches, were implemented at the end of the second year of his regime. Indeed, in 1973, Idi Amin banned 11 churches, or as he called at the time, sects, with accusation of being unlawful societies. The Full Gospel Church, that is the church funded by the Lazel, was among these churches. In 1977, the ban was extended to other 27 churches and religious organizations, mostly Pentecostal, with the claim that they had international connection, especially with the US, and they were undertaking underground politics in the country. It is, paranoia towards foreigners during his regime has already been well documented in many publications. Though, according to Kevin Ward, an academic working on religion and politics in Uganda, Amin was not just so preoccupied by the international connection of those churches, but he was also greatly fearing the creation of and multiplication of different centers of power, centers that could generate opposition to his regime. This hostility that the Lazel encountered up to the 60s were mainly due to the fact that the Anglican Church, through its political connection, fought hard to stop new forms of Christianity entering the country at the time. The head of the Anglican Church in Uganda in those years, Bishop Leslie Wilfrid Brown, was previously stationed in India, where Pentecostalism was growing since its introduction in the early 20th century, against the backdrop of the first wave of the global movement started with the Azusa movement in 1909. Several North American Pentecostal missionaries who had participated in the Azusa Street revival visited India. And in 1920s, the missionary Robert Cook established the Indian branch of the Church of God in Kerala, where in those years Brown became the principal of the Kerala United Theological Seminary. After his experience in India, where he saw and experienced the growth of Pentecostalism, the bishop was really preoccupied by the rapid expansion of this movement, and he didn't want to see the repetition of a similar flourishing in Uganda. Historically, both the Anglican and the Catholic Church have held near a monopoly of the Uganda religious landscape since Christianity first took hold in the Buganda monarchy and played an inextricable role in national politics. The colonial powers favored the Anglican Church and the Protestant chief, giving them access to land and working to retain their authority, creating much grievance amongst the Catholic, the biggest religious group, and the Muslim. In the middle of the 20th century, newcomers such as the Pentecostal churches were perceived as a danger to these established gravitational centers. These were the challenging times of Reconstruction and the end of colonialism in the 60s, and then after Idi Amin, we can see the emergence of new churches that were coming along the third wave of Pentecostalism. Churches that were very spontaneous, were local, were not coming through missionary work from the global north, and so on. And so the 60s and the 80s were quite complicated times. And in the 80s, especially during the time of Reconstruction, we can see that actually what really played an important role was and helped those churches to flourish and become very appealing with the public, were their capacity to attract people through healing and miracles. Miracles and the healing power attributed to the Pentecostal churches are recognized by many in the field as the driving force for their proliferation in the turmoil of the early post-colonial and Reconstruction era. Miracles are an intrinsic and crucial component of Pentecostal theologies and praxis. As we know, miracles, as well as the presence of the Holy Spirit, the urgency to conversion and evangelize while fulfilling God's plans, are central in the Pentecostal experience of faith. In the Ugandan context of the post-Amin era, where the everyday often has a truly apocalyptic quality, terrible quality of life, and many challenges, miracles represented a spiritual state of rapture, to use Marcia Frantani's word, from the adverse reality and experience of holy grace in the adversities of the everyday life. But miracles in Ugandan Christian community, in the Pentecostal Uganda Christian community, also play a unique role in providing an historical account of the genesis of the movement, an explanation of the successful planting and spread of this religious community, in particular tormented times in the battered region, in this very challenged region. Miracles were not only associated with healings, as these churches operated, because these churches operated also under another kind of miracle, that is the miracle of protection, as narrated by many participants in the field, with divine forces allowing them to plant new communities and proliferate during incredibly challenging time and hard times, testifying that their presence in the country was really part of God's plans. The narrative that Pentecostalism could be initiated in the country in such difficult times through what is called in the field the miracle of protection function as a sort of communal unifying story in such diverse community of churches. Again, I really think it's important to unpack the history and the origins of the movement to understand what brings them together, being them really divided and diverse movement nowadays, and what motivates them. And so miracles played such an important role. And stories of angels appearing on the roof of churches, people hearing Pentecostal singing in deserted places, stories of preachers being shielded from bullets by invisible forces, and the sudden conversion of Idi Amin soldier in the act of killing or punishing Pentecostal believer, are recurrently narrated and maintained amongst those churches. One of the most cited stories in the field was the one of a car accident of the vice president under Amin, that was General Mustafa Adrisi, vice president between 77 and 78. As Pastor Mutebe narrated, when in 78, around Easter, congregants of his church went together in the building despite the regime ban. In his church, there was the full gospel church, the first Pentecostal church established in Uganda. The local authorities came and sent soldiers there. Once at the church, they took 250 congregants to the infamous Nakasero State Research Bureau, and those ones who were recognized from magazine as the leader of the church were taken into the Luzira maximum security prison. From a participant, it emerged that the plan was to throw those leaders into Lake Victoria in sack in order to kill them. But then the miracle happened. The vice president, Mustafa Adrisi, who was also the Minister of Internal Affairs at the time, was coming back to Kampala to sign the order to kill those people. And so this is a quote, to call us. On the day he was going to do it, he had a terrible accident. Later, we have been transferred to the police station, and so they haven't been killed because actually the vice president didn't make it to sign the order. And Bishop Lubinga was telling this story. He also reported that famously and allegedly, because I don't have real material data to confirm that, Adrisi said to Amin, "Be careful of the born agains," it means Pentecostal. "Those people have power." The myth of the miraculous and troubled origins play an important role in motivating those churches' public action in contemporary Uganda, as it is around those shared stories that they find commonalities to allow them to overcome their diversity and organize together. However, how the public role should be organized in Uganda seems to be an element of contention and division. Pentecostal charismatic churches that emerged from the turmoil of the 70s and of the 80s also called born-again church, indigenous born-again church, and that attract the great majority of Pentecostal believers in Uganda, are largely organized into two affiliations. The National Fellowship of Born Again and Pentecostal Churches, from now on I will call the National Fellowship, that since 2021 is led by Bishop Joshua Lwere, and the Born Again Faith Federation, or BAF. So the National Federation and BAF. And this latest one, BAF, is led, since its origins, led by Dr. Joseph Serwada, a very well-known Pentecostal leader in the country. In 1989, only 3 years after Museveni came to power, in fact he came to power in 1986, a new bill to govern and regulate non-governmental organization activities in the country was proposed, and the year after, in 1990, was made into law. This is the Non-Governmental Organizations Registration Act, requiring all the NGOs to register under the Ministry of Internal Affairs. The so-called non-traditional churches, that means not the mainline churches, were requested to register. These churches were required to register under the NGO Act, and they had to cancel or invalidate the previous certificates, and they had to renew as non-governmental organization every year, making the process time-consuming and bureaucratic. And also to register as an NGO is quite expensive because it costs 100,000 Uganda shilling a year. And many small churches overcome these affiliations. And there are mechanisms to overcome that. But anyway, it's an expensive and time-consuming process. And most of all, it keeps them separate from mainline churches that are officially recognized. And still, Pentecostal churches don't have the legal recognition as proper churches. In the same year of the Non-Governmental Organization Registration Law, the National Fellowship of Born-Again Pentecostal Churches, so the first fellowship, was created. It was established partly as a response to this new legislation, as Pentecostal churches felt that they need to engage more with politics, and that they also need to overcome suspicions around them and around these churches. So participants in the field described the first 10 years of this national federation as not particularly significant, as this federation was mainly providing support to their own churches in difficult times, and they weren't really having a public voice. Furthermore, the membership to the National Fellowship was nominal, and church members were not formally registered or bound to it. But in March 2000, with the national and international visibility on the restoration of the 10 Commandments of God cult, the National Fellowship became more active in support and in defense of the Ugandan Pentecostal community, and so really started to be very active in the public scene. What I'm mentioning, the restoration of the 10 Commandments of God cult, was a cult that it was established in Kanungu, in the Western region, and regularly registered as a Pentecostal church under the NGO Registration Act. On the 17th of March 2000, the news broke on national media that the membership committed of this cult or church committed mass suicide while other bodies were found in the proximity of the church building, with a total of 799 deaths. The National Fellowship became vocal in dissociating this cult from the Pentecostal community. In 2001, the National Fellowship invited President Museveni to attend a service in to the Namirembe Christian Fellowship, a Pentecostal church. This is recorded as the very first of many other that we follow presidential appearance in Pentecostal churches. It was during the electoral campaign, and in front of the church membership, the president was asked to remove the annual renewal of the Pentecostal churches through the NGOs Regulation Act, as it was creating a dual treatment for different Christian denominations in the country, as the mainline churches were exempted from doing so. In February 2006, Museveni was invited again by the National Fellowship to the large Namboole Stadium in Kampala for a Pentecostal gathering. And in that occasion, he recommitted himself and he promised to reconsider the abolition of the annual renewal of the Pentecostal churches. At the time, he commissioned 3 of his ministers from his government to work and materialize his promises. Urged by the ministers, Dr. Serwadwa was appointed as chairman of a national task force to unify all the Pentecostal churches and fellowship into a very structured, well-organized and formal national organization. But many of these churches refused to commit and sign a binding agreement, seeking instead to reclaim their identity that they weren't organized churches as the mainland one, and asserting their diversity and informal nature. In this moment of confrontation, Dr. Serwadwa separated from the National Fellowship and created the second fellowship, independent, that would bring together all the Pentecostal and evangelical churches, keen to create a formalized and accountable network able to negotiate with the government and to sit in relevant religious organizations, as, for example, in the Interreligious Council of Uganda. In February 2009, the Born Again Faith Federation, or BAF, as I mentioned before, was officially launched, and Dr. Serwadwa became the presiding apostle and main public voice of this organization. One of the most contrasting and debated issues between the two federations is the nature of Pentecostalism itself, the way Pentecostal churches should be organized and conceptualized, and made liable of congregational scrutiny, undergo theological training, and have formalized links to politics and to other churches, especially mainline churches, through interreligious council. While BAF is a strong promoter of a regulatory framework for Pentecostal expression, the National Fellowship is deeply in opposition. This contrast became particularly visible on social media, and other religious spaces in light of the proposed National Religious and Faith-Based Organization policy, led by the now ex-Minister of Ethics and Integrity, Father Simon Lokodo. The draft policies that was discussed in 2019, 2020, the draft policies shared with religious leaders proposed to reform the legal status of the Pentecostal churches and their need to register as NGO. As we know by now, an ongoing worry for this religious community through the creation of a new agency based in the Directorate of Ethics and Integrity that would register, monitor, and approve new religious organizations or new churches and oversee the operation of all the religious faith-based organizations in Uganda, liaising between them and the government. In order to be part of and recognized by the agency, all the religious organizations should comply to certain criteria decided by the government. Although, while drafting this policy, this guidance wasn't completely clear, it implied a lot of formalization around theological training, for example, and strong engagement with the government. And I would like to show you a quote from a very supportive member of BAF who really would like to be part of this new federation, of this new, was very in support of this new policy. And he said, this pastor said, the memory of the persecution is in our blood. It was an ugly experience being persecuted by the state. That is why we want to settle. In Rwanda, they closed down thousands of churches. I know that our President Museveni is different from Kagame, but we don't know who's coming after. And so the fear of who's coming after, the fear of the future political relation is still there and is affecting their anxiety and their desire of clarifying their public status and protect themselves. So this memory of the past is there. Pentecostal churches in Uganda have historically been divided in different ways along lines of the second and third wave of global Pentecostalism, around the personalities of pastors that publicly fight in what is publicly defined as pastor wars, where you see Pentecostal pastors really challenging each other in social media, television, radios, and so on. Around theological underpinnings, and more recently across the two main national federations, the National Federation, and BAF, who have different understanding of how Pentecostal churches should be organized. Besides moral campaigns, what constitutes to bring them together is seeking protection from and connection with the state, which in Uganda means mediating the relationship with Museveni and his family. So I would like just to spend a few minutes now to talk about this relation between Pentecostalism and Museveni, but also Museveni, how he perceives his role with the Pentecostal community, because I think it's very important, again, to understand and unpack that in order to understand the Pentecostal public action in Uganda. And soon after the January 2021 election, Museveni and the ruling party were reconfirming power for a sixth term. After violent election during which 54 people were killed and more than 1,000 arrested. And after that, Pentecostal pastor visited the State House in Entebbe to congratulate the president and his wife, Janet Museveni. In a joint statement read by Pastor Kayanja, the Pentecostal leader commended the leadership of Museveni, the religious freedom that he was giving in the country, and his role as a protector of the Pentecostal community, reiterating the long-standing mutual support between them and the president. So after a very difficult election, they went to the State House. A good representation of Pentecostal leader went to the State House to congratulate the president. And Pastor Servada said, "Today we came to congratulate you upon your victory. Our relationship with you and the NRM, the ruling party government, is not a seasonal affair, but a lasting and deep partnership for our country. Your victory is ours, Uganda's and for Africa as well. It proved that when godly people are in leadership, the people rejoice. As a father of the nation, like Moses in the Bible says, God has used you to deliver several freedoms in this country, including the freedom of worship, among others." While Pentecostal churches have evolved their political stance under Museveni, they became political public actors during the Museveni era, the relationship between Museveni and Pentecostalism, or more generally religion, is not always linear and deserves some explanation, although it can be largely inscribed within its general political pragmatism and utilitarianism that constitute a great part of Museveni's political approach. Museveni came from a family that belonged to the Balokole revival of the Anglican Church of Uganda. This is a revival within the Anglican Church of Uganda in the 30s and in the 40s, that it was a charismatic revival. And so Museveni is familiar with charismatic form of Christianity. Museveni attended a church, the Church of Uganda primary school. But for his secondary studies, he went to the government school in Mbarara, in the southwest region. This school had a reputation as a much more liberally minded school than the mission schools at the time, but still with a largely Protestant Christian ethos. Museveni was by the time a revivalist Christian, a leading figure in the school Christian Union. This would be in the period just preceding independence and perhaps a year or two afterwards. He was also politically conscious and broke with the Christian Union, but at the National Conference they rejected his campaign to condemn the Rhodesian unilateral declaration of independence. In a time of political changes and decolonization in Africa, Museveni found the evangelical and revivalist turn away from politics to be unacceptable. Increasingly, this distanced him from Christianity, especially during his year in Dar es Salaam University, where more radical politics were discussed, and there was a strong support to the Frelimo struggle against the Portuguese colonialist power. And this really, sorry to
intervene, but your time is almost up.
Okay,
so 1 or 2 more minutes to
super. Fantastic, thanks so much. So I won't spend so much time to delineate the relation with between Museveni and the Pentecostal movement. If you're not saying that actually he never declared himself to be a Pentecostal, but his wife and his daughter are famous Pentecostal leader in the country. But there's definitely support towards the Pentecostal movement also for the fact that actually rarely contested his power in Uganda. And so it's this kind of exchange between the two. But to conclude, data on the exact number of Pentecostal believers in Uganda are not available. Although we have census data, but we know that the question in the census data of 2014 were not so clear, and so actually current data are not so defined. And we know that the great majority of Ugandans still now remain Catholic or Anglican, although Pentecostalism is clearly the denomination that is having the greatest impact on the country's public affairs, positioning their moral conservatives' battle on family law, divorce, sexual rights, and procreation at the center of the national agenda. It's interesting to see how, over the course of a few decades, the Ugandan Pentecostal community managed to grow from an underground minority into a national agenda and policy-setting movement, intimately connected to center of power. So this movement, this change, this shift from minority group with no power and not connected to power to a very influential group, powerful movement that has got strong connection with political center. As hopefully this presentation demonstrated, however, the public action is not only motivated by the moral value and urgent need to impose those values on society. Their energetic public work is also fueled by a reason more embedded within their unique national history and specific relation to power and politics. The troubled origins of the movement still play a fundamental role in shaping their action, aimed at seeking legal recognition and at creating strong connection with center of power and politics. Persecution by the state in the 70s under Idi Amin and the many challenges in the early days, along with miracles and story of divine protection, form a sort of founding myth constantly narrated in these communities. They function as a unifying force across these diverse and sometimes contrasting churches. Even if divided in theological and in practice, no one contests the role that Museveni played in allowing them to establish themselves and flourish in the country. Celebrated as a sort of protector of the Pentecostal community, Museveni benefits from this relationship in many ways, from the support of his leadership to the growing voter bloc they represent. And this becomes even more relevant during his 6th mandate, when opposition against his regime is growing from a very unsatisfied youth. The literature on public religion in Africa is mushrooming. We know that. Nobody can deny that. There is a sense, however, that amongst those publications, there is still room to produce studies that carefully unpick why certain religious expressions become public in specific times, and what diverse forms of encounters allow them to do so. Often those explanations, I would say from my analysis and from my experience of working in the field, those explanations lie in the stories and narratives that churches produce and share in the politics of the everyday amongst their members. Thank you.